Last week I got a letter from Adrian. He wrote to me saying I'm disabled and live in constant fear of my benefits being reassessed and stopped and being forced onto the streets. Could the Prime Minister do what the Chancellor failed to do yesterday and apologise to those that went through such anguish and upset during the threat of cuts in their personal independence payments?
When you are faced with having to take very many, very difficult decisions, including many spending reductions, as we were after becoming the government in 2010, you do not always get every decision right. I'm the first to accept that, to admit that, and on every occasion that happens, it's very important you learn the lessons. But as we do so, we will continue to increase spending on disability benefits, which will be £46 billion, more than £46 billion a year by the end of this Parliament, compared to £42 billion when I became the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, government figures published only this morning show the number of people with disabilities and homeless is now up by 39% since 2010. 300,000 more disabled people are living in absolute poverty. That's why people like Adrian are very worried. There has been big disarray in the Cabinet over the last few days. So can the Prime Minister now absolutely, categorically rule out any further cuts to welfare spending in the lifetime of this Parliament? Simply yes or no.
Well, let me respond to all the points he just made. I mean, first of all, he talked about the number of people in poverty. We've actually seen poverty fall over this Parliament. The second thing he referred to is the regrettable rise in homelessness, with figures out today, but homelessness is still 58% below the peak that it reached under Labour. I think that is important. Now, he talks about the number of disabled people, and this is a government committed to supporting the disabled, but it is worth making the point that in the last 2 years there are extra 293,000 disabled people who've got into work. And we want to continue, as we've set out in our manifesto, to close that disability gap. Now, as for the question about further welfare reductions, let me repeat the statement that the new Welfare Secretary made on Monday, the Chancellor made on Tuesday, and happy to make again. I dealt with these issues on Monday. I mean, if he doesn't ask the questions, he can't exactly... I turned up and gave the answers, even though he hadn't given the questions. But we're very clear, we are not planning additional welfare savings other than the ones that we set out in our manifesto and that are in train.
Mr. Speaker, my question was actually about the poverty of people with disabilities, which the Prime Minister did not answer. In his failure to explain how he would fill the hole in his budget left by the change of heart on PIP, the Chancellor said, and I quote, "We can absorb such changes." If it's so easy to absorb changes of this nature, why did the Chancellor and the Prime Minister ever announce it in the first place? Will he now listen and learn and withdraw the £30 per week cut to disabled ESA claimants, which his government is pursuing?
The changes to employment and support allowance have been through both Houses of Parliament, and it is important to note that employment and support allowance for the most disabled, that is the support group, are up by almost £650 a year under this government. We've increased the higher rate of attendance allowance, we've increased carers allowance, we've increased the enhanced rate of PIP, because we believe a strong economy should support the most disabled people in our country, and that's exactly what we've legislated to do. Now, if the right honourable gentleman wants to get on to discussing black holes, I say bring on the argument, because we inherited an 11% budget deficit from the Labour Party. And under this team of ministers and this Chancellor of the Exchequer, we have cut that deficit by 2/3 since we became the government. From Labour, all we've had is more proposals for more spending, more welfare, more taxes, more debt. All of the things that got us into the biggest mess with the biggest black hole in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, if it's all so fine and dandy, then the question has to be asked, why did the member for Chingford feel it necessary to resign as Work and Pensions Secretary, complaining that the cuts being announced were to fit arbitrary fiscal targets? He said they were distinctly political rather than in the national economic interests. In the initial announcement, he proposed cuts in PIPs, then changed his mind. Isn't the honourable member for Chingford right when he says this was a political decision rather than one made in the interests of people in this country?
I believe that after 7 or 8 years of economic growth, it is right to be targeting a surplus, because a responsible government puts aside money for a rainy day. I don't want to be part of a government that doesn't have the courage to pay off our debts and leaves them instead to our children and grandchildren. And that is the truth. What is dressed up as compassion from the party opposite just means putting off difficult decisions and asking our children to pay the debts we weren't prepared to pay ourselves.